Are the Jews safe in the UK today?
Wow, okay. No, frankly, it's been coming for a while, but you can't say that Jews are safe in the UK when you've seen what happened in Manchester last year. And that was building up for a long time. So we've seen assaults and we've seen attacks. We saw people going, a person went into a kosher store brandishing a knife not long after October 7th and got away with it. You know, we've been seeing the build up to this kind of attack for a long time, and it was sort of inevitable in a way, which is sad to say. But no, Jews are not safe in the UK, unfortunately.
Let me introduce you. So you've become, let's say, famous after October 7th. You are not Jewish. You are married to a Jewish Israeli called Adam Anit, whose cousin was him and his family were the unfortunate protagonist of a very famous video from October 7th. Tzachi Dan and his family were, their abduction of their family was live streamed by Hamas from the Nahal Oz kibbutz. That was one of the most shocking videos that we've seen that day. It was shocking because the Hamas terrorists actually live streamed from one of the family members' Facebook, the family together sitting on the floor of their kitchen. Tzachi Dan's hands were bloody with the blood of his daughter Mayan that was murdered minutes before that in the safe room. And that live stream for like 11 long minutes showed them terrorized while the Hamas terrorists are pointing their guns at them, while bombs are exploding outside. This is the October 7th that we saw, that the world saw. Can you tell us about you, about your family? You live in Brighton in the UK. How did you live that day and your story ever since?
It feels strange to think about before October 7th, actually. It feels like
It does.
Life began on October 7th, or the new universe that we live in began that day. And it's a struggle to remember what happened before. But I remember I was in bed, asleep, which lots of people were, and Adam came into the room and woke me up and said, something terrible is happening. Israel's been attacked. There's a terrorist attack. And for me, I woke up very groggily, and it's not unusual for there to be a terrorist attack in Israel, unfortunately. So I didn't react in the way that, you know, I would have if I'd known what had actually happened. And I was just like, okay, there's a terrorist attack. Why are you waking me up? It's 7 a.m. And he said, no, it's really bad. And then I was worried because he wouldn't have done that. He wouldn't have woken me up. And it was very early on a Saturday morning, and he was on his way to go to shul anyway because he guards for the CST, which is our very wonderful guarding organization that has volunteers around the country that go every weekend and guard the services that happen in every shul or Jewish building. And he went straight to go to shul, put on his stab vest, as he normally does. Even then, that was what we were living with for many years. And he went, and I was left alone to watch what was happening on TV and try to keep my daughter away from it as much as possible. But it's a bit of a blur, actually, because I don't really remember much from that day. It was really, maybe I've suppressed it somehow, but it was a real blur. And then he came home after the shul, and then we saw that the local Palestine Solidarity Campaign had organized a rally for the next day, for October 8th. And we were shocked because it was nothing, you know, the terrorists were still in the country. We couldn't believe that they were organizing a rally for what exactly. Nothing had happened in Gaza at that point. So Adam was in town that next day to go shopping, and we hadn't got the full story of what happened to the family at that point because the communications were very difficult and it was very confusing. And then, you know, we were seeing some videos come out, but we hadn't seen that video yet, although a lot of the family had seen it live. And he came home from seeing what had happened in town, which was in the sort of centre of Brighton, and he had filmed some of it. And so he came home and he said to me, they were supporting the massacre. They were supporting it. And I just couldn't believe it. I just couldn't. And I didn't watch it for a while, the video that he brought back, because I was busy with other things and we were still trying to find out the news. And then we got the news in the evening about Adam's family, and we were reeling from that. So I finally watched the video, and there was a woman in the video, a British Palestinian student, who was literally saying that what had happened was beautiful and inspiring, and that this was a day of celebration. Oh. Yeah, it was very blatant. And then I was so shocked by that, and also reeling from the news about Adam's family. And I was so outraged that I put that clip onto X. And immediately everybody had the same reaction, because it was absolutely horrifying to see somebody do that when the terrorists were actually still in the country, still murdering people. Israel hadn't reacted at all at that point. They were just dealing with the invasion, the immediate aftermath of the invasion. And so it became very clear for me in that moment that not only were our family and Jews in general in danger in Israel, but that threat was here too. Their supporters of the murderers of our family were here in Brighton. So it became our fight in a way that was deeply personal on lots of different fronts for defending our family here and there. And so then after I put that clip onto X, it went viral, and then the national media picked it up. And then eventually we found out that that woman was a women's officer at the local university and held quite a lot of influential positions. And
why am I not surprised?
I know. We saw a lot of that after, especially when the news of the sexual violence came out. We saw a lot of what would be traditionally people that would care about that sort of thing, not care at all, and in some ways, some instances deny it or justify it, even worse. It wasn't a surprise, but the story just kept getting worse and worse. She was variously holding different positions of authority within the university world, and the media, we kept finding out this stuff, and it kept being covered, and eventually she was arrested. And it was, I think, the first arrest for supporting a proscribed organisation after October 7th, namely Hamas. And so that week was a real blur of, dealing with the trauma and the immediate horrors of what had happened to the family. But at the same time, we had counter-terror police in our home and dealing with interviews and recording this crime. And so it was actually a real catalyst for us about what we needed to do.
Yeah, I think this feeling, looking at the past as something blurry, I think is common. From my personal, I live in Milano. We didn't have an immediate, let's say, backlash or protest, but they waited 1 week. And then the next Saturday, they started with the protests pro-Hamas. We didn't have such blatant incidents like in your viral video. But actually, I think it's a mistake to think about this as a one-person thing. It's this professor or whatever is not the issue. The issue is something much, much bigger that is pervasive in the West, and not just in the UK, in the entire West. And this is actually what my podcast is about. It's not about October 7th. It's not about, many people don't know the stories, but we know the stories, and it's been almost 2.5 years. I think the story right now is something different. But it is important to go back to October 7th. I remember that day I had to go to dinner with friends, and by the time we got to dinner, me and my wife, I think it was the news spoke something of about 200 deaths. So just now that we're talking about 1,200 and 254 hostages, even at the end of that day, when you're saying that somebody was protesting for Hamas in the street the next day, it was not even clear the extent of what happened, but they were already ready to condemn Israel, to support the terrorists. And this is something very, very telling.
Actually, the National Palestine Solidarity Campaign here applied for permission to have a march the following weekend, and you have to give a 7 days notice. And they had done that on October 7th.
Yeah. 1 minute,
So,
probably.
yeah.
They
I mean,
either
it's just,
knew or they jumped on it.
no, I don't think they knew, but this is the immorality of what they are. They didn't pause. It was an opportunity. And so they saw that opportunity and they took it. And I think that is very telling about who they are and what their motivations are, and the lack of care that they have and the dehumanization of Israelis that they feel. And even on that rally on October the 8th, they knew that hundreds of civilians had been murdered, and they said it at the beginning of the event. So they were aware.
They were celebrating it.
And after that, they went on to compare Hamas to Nelson Mandela and the French resistance and these sort of whitewashing positive descriptions of them. But not illegal, but definitely immoral, having already said that they killed 500 or so civilians. And they were really positive about the paragliding
They don't
invasion
consider
technique.
any Israeli civilian. They don't consider any Israeli
No,
civilians. So
exactly.
They always have
They're
these.
all settlers.
Exactly. They all have these excuses or a way to interpret things in a way that justifies the violence. Since every Israeli joins the army, so even if you're 78 years old, you're still a soldier. So you can be killed. Or
babies are potential soldiers.
yeah, exactly. If you're 6 months old, you're going to become a soldier. And
Yeah,
you're a settler.
yeah.
And you're a settler. It's, the curious thing is, when they talk about the settlements in the so-called West Bank. By the way, I stopped calling it the West Bank. I call it Judea and Samaria, but we don't have to agree on that. But
let's not go there.
For Israelis, the settlements, or from our point of view, the settlements were in the so-called occupied territories. But for them, everything is occupied territory,
Absolutely.
and everyone is a settler. So
Yep.
they use these words to justify it's a means to an end, and the end is kill all the Jews, unfortunately.
Yeah.
That's the goal, and they whitewash it and sugarcoat it in some way. Can we move on to the memorial? Because your story doesn't end on October 8th. Your story just starts there. Can you tell us a little bit about the Palmyra Square Memorial? What happened there?
So on the Shloshim, the 30 days after the massacre, a group of local Jewish people got together and decided to do a marking that moment. There's a square in Brighton called Palmyra Square, and it's in the kind of heart of the Jewish community in the city. So there's 3 synagogues within walking distance from the square. 2 are still being used, 1 is shut down. And it's very close to the Brighton Jewish Community Centre, which is about a 15-minute walk. So very much in the heart of the community. The square itself and that surrounding area was actually built by a Jewish man in the 1800s. And the Palmyra honorific is from the Queen of Portugal, because it was an honorific she gave to this Jewish developer, if you want to say. And he was actually very involved in the emancipation of Jewish people in Britain. So he's a very important figure in the history of Brighton, but also in the history of British Jewry. And it's the place where the Hanukkah is every year, and it's known to be a place where the Jews gather. Occasionally, the Palestine Solidarity Campaign would start a march from there, and it would be seen as a provocation.
Yeah.
And that was something that they did mid-October. They turned up and they destroyed a hostage memorial that was there for the children that were hostage at the time, because it was before the first ceasefire deal. They ripped down balloons as they walked through the square. They trampled all through the square. And it was a deep insult, actually, to the community, and very much provocative. And so we did this memorial event in a way to kind of not take back, but like sort of clear the air of the square, if you want to say, from this kind of hostile group that came and destroyed our hostage display. And actually that same event they ended up on the seafront, which was nearby, and a couple of youth ended up assaulting a Jewish man who was there. So we decided to mark the Shoshim there because it was a very important place for Jews in the community. And we also wanted to kind of purge the bad feelings that the pro-Palestinian hateful people had brought to the place. So the community came along, and it was a group of volunteers that became active after October 7th because we were all kind of looking for each other and looking for something to do. And we decided to together set up this day where we spent all day reading the names that we had from the massacre. And we stood there for about 10 hours and we read every single name. And we had different people coming to read the names. And actually at the time, Adam's other cousin, Moria, was here with her mother. And they had come to kind of get a break from what was happening in Israel. Another cousin of Zahi, Idan. And so we spent a lot of time together. And she came and she read Mayan's name. And that was a really profound moment for us. It was a very kind of ad hoc thing. We didn't know what we were doing. We just set up a table, we had a microphone, and people came and laid flowers at this point in the square. And that day, we got so much abuse from people. It was absolutely horrifying. People were shouting at us, people were challenging us. It was so aggressive and hostile. It was kind of a wake-up call for us as well, that being in public and grieving for, we were literally just saying their names. There was nothing political about it. We weren't flag waving. It was just about remembering the dead. And that was just met with so much aggression that it was actually really terrifying. And then at the end of the night, it was dark, it was late, it was about 10 p.m. A balaclava wearing young man came running at us, knocked over the table and ran off. And it was just so scary that they would be moved to actual physical aggression as well. So, he got away with that. There were no police reaction, there was no police protection at that time, there was no response. They did come out and have a look around and see if they could find him, but there was it wasn't really taken that seriously. So then after that, it sort of naturally carried on, and there was a real feeling in the community that they wanted to carry on doing this. So every single night we did a service, and it sort of evolved over time into a formal service that we stuck to. But every night then we told the story of a different victim of October 7th and kind of brought them back to life and told their story in more detail rather than just saying their names. And that was very important to us, to not just the circumstances of their horrific death, but also who they were, what they loved, who they loved, and just make them human again. Because I think a lot of the problem with what we're facing now is that Israelis and Jews have been dehumanized to the point where people don't see them as people. So that was really important to us. And then it just got kind of bigger and bigger and bigger. And we got the chief rabbi came to do a service, and that was profoundly moving. And then we had all the heads of the progressive and the reform and the different leadership from different, like the board of deputies president came, and all sorts of sort of dignitaries were coming, and it became something really important to the national community as well. And then we started up this Yellow Ribbon campaign, which was a sort of combination of what was already being used or had already been used by the Hostage Forum as a symbol of the hostages. Yeah. And we combined it with the British connected hostages. So there were quite a few, not only with British citizenship like Emily Damari, but also connected to British people like Zahi. There was Eli Sharabi, and he has Welsh family, relatives, Stephen Brisley and Sharon Lifshitz and Or Levy, and all these people had some connection. And we would get hostage families would come and speak about their loved one, and we would also there was a British victim called Jake Marlowe who was murdered at the Nova Festival. He had made Aliyah a few years before and ended up being shot to death by Hamas when he was helping people escape from Nova. And his parents came and gave a really moving eulogy for him at the memorial, and then we made a connection with them, and now they're part of our family too.
I know that it's very emotional for me to hear this, but there is a but, right? I know that the memorial in Brighton has been vandalized numerous times, and so as you are doing this service every day, did you continue to receive abuse every day, even as this thing grew? And can you tell us a little bit about the violence that the memorial and you guys received?
So the memorial was vandalized over 50 times. Sometimes it would be probably the same person doing it multiple times, but sometimes not. The memorial was entirely smashed to pieces 5 times, many times in the daytime on camera. There was one person who very violently destroyed it, tried to rip up the pictures of children, was throwing the toys around, broke everything, and was screeching about various things about Israel. And he was captured on film doing that. That went national news as well. And he was never punished. He actually handed himself in. And
really?
Yeah,
That's
because
crazy.
there was so much coverage, but he ended up, it was so badly handled, and that's another layer of the problem, right? Because there's the hate, but then there's the
even
reaction.
Slap on the wrist, like nothing?
Nothing. They couldn't prove his mens rea at the time, and he said mens rea means intention in law, so they couldn't prove that he intended it as a hate crime against Jews. So they couldn't prosecute as a hate crime. And he denied that it was a hate crime. He said he was triggered by the memorial because his friend had died a little while ago and the flowers made him angry. So, there's these very spurious and unbelievable excuses given when it's very clear what this was. But this is the problem, is that there's the hate and then there's the lack of action in reaction to it. And that's when the Jewish community starts to feel very isolated. But yes, we did get a lot of abuse. We did get some really strange people coming up to us with their anti-Semitic conspiracies. We did get horrible things left at the memorial. So someone even left feces on the memorial book twice. That happened. On the faces of dead people. I mean, it was just, if you can imagine as disgusting a thing as possible, I think that was the worst thing that happened. They would leave things there, like they left a picture of that guy who set himself on fire, Aaron Bushell, in America, outside the embassy. They left his image there. So quite kind of sinister, weird things, and sometimes really weird things. Like they left a little egg timer, like as though the clock is ticking kind of threat. So
God.
it ranged, and the full range of, I saw a teenage boy spit on the memorial, but on the other side as well, we got so much love and support. And so it was actually a really good thing to do, because we know the hate is very loud and very angry, and it can become the only thing that we experience in the world. But actually, when you risk something and you're standing out in public, it gives people, nice people, kind people, a chance to find you. Because often the Jewish community in the diaspora is behind fences and high walls, and people can't find them or can't interact with them or can't express anything because they can't connect. So this gave people an opportunity to come find us, and they did. And we had all sorts of people come and attend services, Christians, Muslims, Baha'i. We had a lot of Iranians come. There's quite a big Iranian diaspora community here. And it gave us that balance, I think, between understanding that we were facing quite a lot of animosity, but also feeling love and warmth from people too.
Look, I have to ask you this because I know that you are, in the articles that you write and also the way you've been presented, and you were never, You were never hiding it. You guys are on the left. And you even said that you chose to live in Brighton because it was considered the most progressive town in England. So the question is this. Two questions. First of all, from your, let's say, progressive community, not Jewish, did you receive any disappointments? Did you lose friends? Did you receive support? And the second question is, how do you feel today about the left in Europe, in the UK, and their general reaction, not just in Brighton, to Israel, to what happened on October 7th?
I always think that I didn't leave the left. The left left me.
Yes.
I'm still left, but I'm in a very left behind by the left. Actually, what happened to us as a family was that when Jeremy Corbyn was elected leader of the Labour Party in 2015, that was the beginning of our challenging
departure. Yeah.
Yes. So actually, that was the moment where we lost our entire world, actually, because we were still working in that world, we were still socializing in that world. It was our whole kind of social environment.
Yeah, if I can add, your background is in climate activism and research,
yes.
Also your husband. So you're, let's say, I don't want to use cliches, but you're a couple with leftist agenda, leftist worldview, leftist town, completely in that world, and then you're saying things start to crack.
Yeah. So Jeremy Corbyn started it. When he became leader of the Labour Party, we were still embedded in that world, and we started to see everybody around us. And actually, at first, he looked kind of convincing. He was talking about kinder, gentler politics. He was reading out emails from his constituents in Parliament. It looked all very different and very interesting. And he looks like a kindly old grandpa, doesn't he? So, our politics weren't that far away from his, and yet there was something that we knew was different about him as well. And gradually over time, that came out more and more in the press and online. That was when we joined Twitter in those days and began to find out more about this guy. And there was one point where it was found that it was revealed that he had previously sat on a panel in Doha with a bunch of kind of former Hamas prisoners that had been released in the Charlotte deal. And one of them was the man that orchestrated a bombing in Matzah Cafe in Haifa during the Second Intifada. And
yeah, I remember that.
It was a bombing in an Arab-Israeli cafe, and other members of Adam's family were impacted by that. So they were having their usual weekend coffee as a family, and they were involved in the bombing, and his 16-year-old cousin Orly was killed. So this is terrorism from Hamas has touched his family before. And then after that, it was like a shock, like an electric shock. And he realized that he couldn't stay quiet any longer, that this was now very personal. So he wrote on X a whole thread about Orly, about this situation that Corbyn had sat on this panel, that he had described them very positively, and that went viral. And then I did another thread about the left and how many instances of anti-Semitism Adam had told me about and how shocking it was. And that also went viral. And then we started to become part of the people that were pushing back against anti-Semitism in Labour. Eventually, we see how that turned out. The HRC ruled against them, which was the first time they've ever done that since the BNP, which was the far-right racist party. And they actually got a scolding more than the BNP. And the BNP actually cooperated more than Labour, which is completely bizarre to me. And so our whole world kind of became upside down very quickly.
You've touched something that is really important to me, and I want to frame it in a way that is correct. So I think for us as Jewish people, we have always been primed, very much rightly so, to be afraid of the right. Okay, we have a history of right-wing hatred that leads to genocide that cannot be underestimated. And when you're saying that the BNP actually reacted in a way that astonished you, positively in a way, like you would not expect them to be more on the side of the Jews in such a thing than the left wing. So
I'm not
tell
saying
me if that's correct.
No, so that's not correct. So what I'm saying is that they responded more, they engaged more with the legal process of the EHRC than the Labour Party did, and they got less severe penalties than the Labour Party did. So I'm kind of saying they're both racist, but towards different people possibly, but they're both racist, but the Labour Party was worse than the BNP.
Okay. Yeah,
that's what I'm saying. But there is an interesting dynamic in the far right or the very hard right world that we could talk about in terms of what's happened since October 7th and maybe before. But there's been this kind of split in the far right in terms of some hate Muslims more than Jews and some hate Jews more than Muslims. So, you know, there's a kind of divergence happening within that world too. But we're seeing that kind of, like, the world is sort of fractured and normal politics is fractured to the point where you can't rely on old ideas about who's the enemy and who's the friend.
Yeah, I think for me personally, it was a wake-up call, October 7th, because I'm pretty much born in the left. My parents always, entire lives, voted Labour in Israel. I believed in the Oslo Accords and peace with Palestinians, two states and all that. So, but it doesn't matter. I shifted towards a more center-right point of view, but my position is not the story here. I think the story here is the Jews in the world maybe need to reevaluate their historic alliance with the left, because the left, let's not talk about the right. The right is a whole story that deserves a full podcast episode. But the historic alliance of the world Jewry with the left needs to be highly reevaluated, because I think what we saw is in many ways the true face of people who claim to be pro-human rights, women, everything. And everything exploded in our faces. So it was a huge wake-up call, and I think many Jews around the world feel orphans. They don't have a home. They don't have a political home anymore. They're afraid of the right. I remember reading about in France, they did a poll within the Jewish community, and they asked the Jewish community, who are they most afraid of? And we're talking about, I don't remember if it was after October 7th or before, but it was definitely after all the terrorist attacks in Paris. And most of the Jews said they were afraid of the right. The thing that scares them the most is the rise of extreme right-wing, Le Pen, that sort of nationalistic movement that historically was, against minorities. But you can't deny the fact that all the terrorism that really actually physically hit the Jews in France in the past decade was, first of all, it was completely Islamist. And second of all, these people had I wouldn't say cooperation, but definitely the approval or the alliance with the left, with the extreme left. So it kind of struck me as odd that people would still be very much afraid of the right. I'm not saying you shouldn't be afraid of the right. You should, probably. But they were not afraid of the left. They didn't perceive them as a threat. And I think after October 7th, correct me if I'm wrong, that crack that you described with your relationship with the left has become more extreme or more obvious.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I mean, it was already there. The fractures were there. We did lose our whole social life and world, and friends left us, and we became more connected to the Jewish community and the people, and actually left-wing people that were fighting anti-Semitism. So it wasn't that we immediately are surrounded by right-wing people now, and I'm not as judgmental about that as I used to be, because I used to be like, I'll never talk to right-wing people, we've got nothing in common. But it's like you find a kind of community, and you become more accepting and more part of a wider story rather than just narrowly, only socializing with people that agree with you on everything. I mean, you put boundaries around that, of course, but I'm not as horribly judgmental as I used to be. But so I think Corbyn
So you were horribly judgmental?
I was very judgmental before. I remember having a lot of arguments with my parents about things and being very berating them for reading the Daily Mail and things, but I don't do that anymore. So yeah, I think what Corbyn did, at least in this country, was to lay a sort of groundwork for what came after October 7th. And October 7th is like the Corbyn years on speed. So it was just like a whole other dimension of horror and exclusion, and it became, a physical threat rather than just words and just, we don't really like you very much. But now it's like, now you agree with the people who want to kill us. So, this is a whole other level of corruption of the left. And what happens is, and I think there's different dynamics in different diaspora communities. So America, being the biggest, has a particular kind of problem with the far right there, which are, white nationalists, white supremacists, and that is a real threat there. They are violent, they do attack Jews, they are, up till October 7th, were, I think, the main kind of physical threat. But Islamists in America are becoming much more common. We had a British Islamist go over to America and hold hostage some people in a synagogue. That is happening too. So I think Islamists in general have become a much bigger threat since October 7th. They were already a threat in Europe, very much so, and that was the main source of threat for us particularly, because that is where the terrorism is mostly coming from, on these shores. And we have much more of an issue with that. And even up till October 7th, when we were looking at European figures for anti-Semitism, when they were identifying where the anti-Semitism was coming from in terms of a perpetrator, it was actually more coming from people with Islamist ideology than from the far right. So we were already seeing that quite a lot before October 7th, and now it's just gone crazy.
Yeah, I think it's actually quite a classic. Jews are the scapegoats. So there is, in my point of view, there is actually an Islamic invasion of Europe. They are coming to conquer. They are coming to, with their slow jihad. They tell you in your face that eventually the UK or France will be a Sharia country. So they don't hide that in a way. But on the other hand, they pick up on the Jews and they do terror and propaganda against the Jews, I think, to divert the attention of the people from the real threat to, the Jews are not a threat to any country in Europe or any community in Europe. We're not proselytizing. We're not trying to make you convert. We're usually very successful and contributing members of any community. And yet the Muslims, who in various phases, they are not as contributing to the local communities and also bring problems of violence and hate crimes, they divert the attention from them to the Jews. This is something that I see happening also in Italy. I see it in France. I see it in the UK. And it's quite scary. Let me give you an example, coming back to the UK and to something that was recently. We had the Golders Green, torching of the ambulances. And there was a member, I wrote her name, a candidate of the Green Party called Topi Olawoyin, that said it was an inside job. So, and then she was kicked out. I think yesterday was the piece of news that said that she was kicked out of the Green Party. So this is an example of blaming the Jews for something that you do to divert the attention from you to the Jews, always giving the opposite of the truth and hiding your own faults and projecting them against the Jews. I saw that you posted about Kemi Badenoch's article yesterday. By the way, we're recording on April 3rd. So just for context, for future viewers. and it's Passover, and Kemi Badenoch wrote a very moving article about anti-Semitism, and I think it is something that I would love to see any leader in Europe express himself this way. But I have a feeling that this is maybe a little bit too little too late for the Tories, while we having, reform and now even restore that seem to be on an enormous rise. I don't know if you want to share some thoughts about that.
I think we have to be really careful and clear about what we're talking about. When we say Islamic invasion, I think that can be a difficult thing to say. I think it feeds a particular kind of hatred towards Muslims. So I think we need to be careful about the kind of language we use. I think when we're talking about the Muslim community, we need to make sure that we're not generating hate towards anybody. And actually, when we talk about...
that. By the way, I accept that. I accept that completely.
So when we use language like Islamic invasion, that can be difficult language to use towards a whole community, and it flattens everybody to one thing, which we want to avoid. So when I talk about the hate coming from that ideology, I talk about ideology. So I'll talk about Islamist ideology. So I know it's like, it feels like you're dancing on the head of a pin, but we're not trying to avoid anything. But there's two different issues going on, which we don't want to conflate. So there's the issue of Islamist ideology, which is all those things of generating aggression and hatred towards Jews and Israel, and wanting to destroy Israel, and wanting to make everybody submissive, or Sharia law, or the caliphate, and there's all sorts of diversity within that as well in terms of what kinds of ideology you're dealing with. And it's very important to understand who your enemy is and not misunderstand who they are. There's that. And then there's like anti-Semitism within the Muslim community, which is higher than the non-Muslim community. So those are different things, although they add up to, and they can overlap sometimes in how we are interacting, or how we're dealing with the problem, or how the problem manifests itself. So what I would say is, I know lots of Muslims who are against anti-Semitism, who don't like the Islamist extreme ideology, who are just trying to live their everyday lives, who contribute, who are part of our community, who are not a threat to us. But then there are elements of that community that are. It's just making sure, and often what we see is the Islamists, the first victim of Islamists are the moderate Muslims within their communities. And so these are the people that we need to support and to make sure that they are protected and enabled to speak out against the hate within their own community. And we do see that happen. So, often we find out about Islamists within mosques or within community because other Muslims report them. So it's not about, we shouldn't be fracturing those relationships too. We should be trying to build them. And I think we have to just be very careful about how we talk about that problem and be very clear. And it's not hiding from it, it's confronting it as it is rather than as someone else may want us to talk about it. So in terms of politics... Oh, sorry.
No. Sorry, I just wanted to interrupt you for a second. I agree, and I appreciate your saying that. Maybe my words seem too harsh. There is a problem of maybe not enough people, not enough Muslim voices call out the Islamists, the radicals, the ones that actually don't do any separation between Islam as a religion and Islam as a totalitarian ideology. So I'm glad to hear that there are voices within the Muslim community in the UK. That said, I use the word invasion. I think we can both agree that mass migration into the UK has become more and more an issue that all sides of the political spectrum are talking about, but nobody has really confronted for many, many years. The Tories were in charge for, 14 years? They promised they would solve or block immigration. They did not. The Labour Party said the same. They did not, maybe more predictably. And now we see this rise, and I don't know what they will do in the election. I don't even know when is the next election. It's of restore and very, very strong language that is actually quite worrying also for Jewish people in a way. They spoke about banning kosher meat. So it's all very, I see it physically, even though I'm not there. The pendulum is going after years of not confronting a problem. You might get a very, very violent reaction against that problem. And I'm glad to hear there are Muslims that are talking about against Islamism, but maybe I'm not exposed to them enough.
I think it's difficult because they are oppressed within that space, because they're most violently attacked by the Islamists. So, it's very scary for them to speak up, and that's part of the problem as well. We need to make sure that those voices are heard more and that they're made to feel safe as well to do it. And that's just about building relationships. But I think in terms of politics, if you look at the Labour Party after Corbyn, it was completely decimated and was facing these charges of anti-Semitism and legally binding actions that they had to complete. They were a complete mess. In the next election, they got into power. All sorts of things can change in politics. That's something I've seen happen. The Tories, I wouldn't count them out entirely, and I think it's hard to make predictions about future elections in any case. With the rise of the Greens, who could have predicted that? And that may be a flash in the pan, and they may go away overnight as well. So once their policies and their people start to be scrutinised a bit more, which we're already kind of seeing, the more attention they get, the more successful they get, the more people will start to look into them a bit more and realise that there's a darkness there too. And actually, the Green Party is more interesting to me to talk about in terms of that left-wing Islamist horrible alliance that has evolved since October 7th. And we look at Mohsen Ali and we look at Zach Polanski, and that is, that's a wet dream for the left, right? The Muslim and the Jew coming together and finding common ground. But actually, there's a dark side to that, and we're starting to see people paying attention to that more. And hopefully there'll be some realization. But the worry is in the country at the moment is there's a lot of division, and there's a lot of extreme groups on either end of the political spectrum becoming more accepted into the mainstream, and that is a worry. And I really wish that the actual mainstream parties like Labour and the Tories could get their act together and really start to be effective and get rid of these sort of forces from the edges, because they will have a bad effect on... We don't want to live like that. That's not the Britain that I know. The Britain I know is much more moderate, much more centrist, and these extremes aren't really comfortable for us. So I'm really hoping that the people in the middle will be able to start to be a bit stronger about the issues that we're facing and actually create some sensible politics.
Okay, look, I don't know if this is an optimistic note to end with, because it's a wish more than a reality, but I do think that this sentiment of wanting to go back to normal is something that many people in the Western world, not just amongst the Jews, share. I'd like to thank you very much for joining me. It was a pleasure to talk to you. It was very interesting and also emotional for me to hear your story. And I will, in the show notes, I'll add where you can be reached, followed, your Substack, your X account. And, thank you so much, Heidi, for what you do.
Thanks.
And for joining me.
Thank you for listening to our story. I hope it wasn't too depressing.
No, we'll edit the depressing parts apart. No, we'll edit the depressing parts out, and we'll have just 10 minutes.
We'll just have the lovely bits.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks,
Uri.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.